Oh boy, I got some news for you. So, yesterday I went out to a case tournament for Battle of Chaos. Obviously, it was a tournament in which the prizing was a case. First place got 5 boxes of that set. Not the best set, but it was free entry, so, of course, you take those, right? I was playing Noids, as you saw with the title, and you best believe I was in there 2-0 and everyone, finishing 6-0. Best deck, baby! Yeah, it did not go that way. Unfortunately, I only ended up finishing 4-2, which was technically a topping record, but you had to be lucky with your tiebreakers. I was not. Ended up placing 12th after Swiss out of 64 players, which is still a solid finish. Bubbling with this deck in a format with 1 Monster Gate is definitely more than most people were expecting. But I think with that card being limited, we have to take a new approach with how to build this deck. So, with that in mind, I would like to present to you guys my March 2022 INFERNOID deck profile. This is one that's a little bit off the wall, and I'm very excited to share with you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is your boy, Pei. I am feeling great, and I'm coming at you with another spicy deck profile. Like I said, today I'm bringing Noids to you. I think this is something that is just really kind of solid this format, even with Monster Gate at 1. So yeah, real quick before I get into the list, I want to give a quick shout out to my friend Elijah. Did a lot of help with some of the cards I'm playing in the extra deck and the side deck. And then he also helped me polish up my Sword Soul matchup, which is kind of a 50-50, but he really just kind of helped me figure out how to play into that. So huge shout out to him. And yeah, let's just get right into the list. So the INFERNOID monsters are very simple, but they have a lot going on, so bear with me as I describe what they do if you aren't familiar. I'm going to run through the numbers that I play first, and then I'll explain in detail what they do if you aren't familiar. I can put timestamps in the description for different parts of the video if you want to skip to that if you're already familiar with these cards, but if you aren't, this is a good video for you. So, for the monsters, you kind of have 3 tiers. You have the big boys, you have the medium boys, and then you have the tiny lads. So, for the big boys, we have 2 copies of Ananku and 2 copies of Daddy Deviati. For the medium boys, we have 1 Attendel, 2 copies of Sightstamas, and then 1 copy of Sajet, passionately nicknamed Shitbrick. We'll talk about why he's bad in a little bit, but you do have to play him, absolutely. He is both the worst and the best one for a reason that I will get into later. And then for the tiny lads, we have 1 Petrulia, 1 Harmodek, and 1 Antra. So, like I said, there's a lot going on, but it all kind of makes sense if you know. So, the 3 tiers of Noids has to do with how many different Noids they have to banish from hand or grave to summon themselves from various locations. The medium and large guys all summon themselves from grave or hand. Meanwhile, the little lads only summon themselves from hand. The little lads take 1 banish, the medium guys take 2, and the big chonkers take 3. And the amount of impact they get is kind of reflected by how much they take to get them on the field. So, starting with the big boys, Ananku on summon is a dark hole and is a spell trap to negate the activation of the card or effect, which is pretty cool. By tributing a monster, not just itself, that's important when we get later on into the profile. And then Deviati is kind of the mirror. It is a heavy storm on summon, and then is a monster activation, negate, and banisher by tributing a monster as well. So these are both really, really good to have in the deck. You play 2 of each because you don't really want to draw them. You really want to have 1 of each of these in deck for your copies of Imagination, but really, really good cards. I think this ratio has been standard for years at this point. So going into the medium men, we have 1 Attendel, 2 Sightstamas, and 1 Sajet, as I said. As I already mentioned, these guys take 2 banishes from hand or grave to summon themselves from hand or grave. And they all do various things, so these guys all during the opponent's turn, well, during either player's turn, technically. These guys are only during the opponent's turn, but I'll get there. During either player's turn, they contribute a monster and then target 1 card in your opponent's grave and banish it. That banishes a card from their grave, not just a monster, so that's really good against like Eldritch. But also, it is important that they just tribute a monster, not an INFERNOID monster. We'll get to why that's relevant in a little while. And then in addition, they all have 1 extra effect. Attendel, if it kills a monster by battle, can attack again. Does not have to be a no monster, so that's pretty cool. Systemos at end of battle phase, if it attacked a monster, can just banish a card on the field non-targeting. Really, really good in the grind game. That's why this is definitely the best one out of these three. And then Sajet, if it swings, I believe, into a monster. Oh no, if it just declares an attack, you can make your opponent banish one card from your extra deck. That doesn't typically matter, but you do play him because he's level 6. That's all to cover with these guys. They're all fairly big. Anonku's 3k, Deviati is 29.29, Atondel's 28.0, Systemos 26.0, and Sajet 24.0. So they're all fairly large. Let's get into the tiny boys now. So these each, like I said, take one banish from hand or grave to only summon themselves from the hand. They cannot summon themselves from the grave. They also have the effect, kind of like the medium boys, to be like DD Crows, but it's only during the opponent's turn. They can also just tribute a monster, not just an Infernoid. And then, like the medium men, they have one unique effect each as well. Petrulia can target a spell or trap on the field to destroy it, but it can't attack that turn. Harmadic can target a monster on the field and destroy it, but can't attack that turn. And then Antra can target a face-up card on your opponent's field and return it to the hand. He can attack, but he has 0 attack, so it doesn't matter. You play one of each of these because these are really good with the best monster in the deck that we're going to get to momentarily. And they're just good cards to have. I mean, these are all really good at like playing into boards, just kind of poking at your opponent, just, you know, making them kind of force their interaction. Really, really good cards. I think this ratio is pretty good. I know for a while I was playing 2 of either of these, not at the same time, of course. But I think you really only need one of each, because you only really need to use its effect once. And the reason that we play such weird numbers of these is because you have access to them at all times with 3 copies of Infernoid Decatron. So what this guy does, he's the only one in the deck that can be normal summoned. And if he is normal or special summoned, you can send an Infernoid monster from your deck to the grave, except itself obviously. And if you do, it gains the card's name, level, and effect. It does not gain the stats. That's the only thing it does not gain. But it's really good because if he's summoned, what oftentimes happens is you're summoning him during your opponent's turn and you're sending like Anonku and Deviati to have 2 negates for free. Like, it's pretty good. But also just playing into a board, you can normal summon him, send one of your little guys like say Harmadic. So you normal Decatron, send Harmadic, and then you can gain Harmadic's effect to try and pop a monster on the field. So he's just really, really good. Definitely the best monster in the deck because he gets access to everything else. And also just Foolishing Noids in a deck that wants to summon Noids by banishing Noids. Sounds pretty good to me. The last monster we are playing is 3 copies of Gamma and 1 Driver. The deck has a lot of actions it could take with no monsters on the field, so it's just absolutely free to do in the deck. This has been standard in the list for a while as well. I was almost tempted to cut it for Imperms, but it's just too good. You really like having that protection from Ash Blossom on some of your cards as well, so that's just really good. But that's it for the monsters. I promise the rest of the deck is not nearly that confusing. It's not very hard once you know what they do, but they all have a lot of text on them. So just describing what they do, all of them have like multiple relevant effects. You just kind of have to, you know, go through it. So that was that. Getting into the spells now. The deck plays quite a lot of them. Like I said, Imperial Order being gone is really good for this deck. So starting off, we have the spell that does it all, 3 copies of Void Banishment. This can discard a card to add a Void spell or trap from your deck to your hand, except itself or null and void, which you're not playing, that card's bad. And then you cannot normal or special summon monsters for the rest of the turn, except Infernoids. This can affect some extra deck plays, but your extra deck doesn't really matter that much, so it's fine. And then it also has a second effect that occasionally comes up, that if your Infernoid monster you control battles an opponent's monster, after damage step, you can send this card to the grave and banish those monsters. Again, doesn't normally come up, but very just niche things can sometimes just play around some random cards. It'll come up occasionally, but yeah, just remember it has that effect. The next spell we play is 3 copies of Imagination. This card is, oh boy, not quite as good in the blind first build, which is what we are playing, but it is just so good that you play it at 3 anyway. So the first effect doesn't really matter. It changes Infernoid monsters you control whose original levels are 2 or higher to level 1, and it halves the battle damage they inflict to your opponent. But the really good effect with this card is that you can send it from field to grave to fusion summon an Infernoid monster from extra deck using monsters from hand or side of the field as fusion materials. However, If your opponent controls a monster that was special summoned from the extra deck, and you do not, you can use 6 monsters in your deck as material, which is just insane. It's also important to note that there is no once per turn on the activation or effect of this card. So if you draw multiples, this is really good with the way the format is now, because there's not a lot of Omni negates going around. Obviously there's Baron de Fleur and there's like the Wandering Griffin Rider, but drawing multiple imaginations can often just dispatch of that because the deck has multiple other spells that demand negation. So it's very easy to just kind of bait those cards and then fusion summon using 6 monsters in your deck. Yeah, this card is really, really good. The more I read it, the more broken it becomes. And then this is a little bit of a controversial pick, but I am playing 2 copies of Void Apocalypse. This is something that I'm playing specifically because of the Go First version. You want to resolve Void Feast as much as possible. And this is also just kind of good because it's obviously not as good as Banishment or Imagination, but it does help you get into Infernoids. The big thing is that it's behind Imagination and Banishment. It's the next most playable Void Speller trap. The other ones are not particularly good. I was playing 1, but I bumped it to 41 and played 2. And it's been fine. You don't really draw multiples. You only ever really want to see one of this, if even. And it's just a nice backup search target. If you already have your Banishment with like a Feast, or you can't like resolve Imagination, this isn't a terrible bet. But that's it for the Void Speller traps. Well, not traps, but Void spells. Let's get into the rest of the spell cards. 3 copies of Lair of Darkness with 1 copy of Terraforming. This has been standard in this deck for years at this point. If you're unfamiliar, the broken interaction with this is that all of the Infernoids tribute to get their various effects for cost, which means you contribute your opponent's monsters for cost. Do you see where I'm going with this? Your opponent has a DPE, you have a Lair up, and you just summon an Infernoid. If they have no response on summon, you're just like, okay, cool, let me tribute that sucker for cost and banish their Celestial. DPE's out of rotation, no draw next turn. Seems pretty good to me. But yeah, you don't play like the Arima because you only want to see so much of this card. You don't want to see multiples. Obviously seeing it is insane, but drawing too many of it can also brick. That kind of is one of the issues with this deck, like I said, is kind of the interior consistency isn't the best, so we tried our best to fix that. And then getting into the pot cards, this is where the deck gets very expensive very fast, but I do have some alternatives. So we are playing 3 copies of Pot of Prosperity and 2 copies of Pot of Extravagance. I understand that not everyone has access to Prosperities, so what you could do, it's definitely not as good, but it's something. You could play a very tight Dogmatica package. You don't play Extravagance in that build either, but you play the double Nadir Servant, 2 Punishment, and then 1 Ecclesia. It gets you another way to play the game, even if it's not the Infernoid game. And also with Nadir, you can send Tribrigade Ferrijit to draw a card and then put a dead Infernoid back. I'm not going to say that it's nearly as good as Prosperity or Extravagance, but it's trying, you know? Like, if you don't have this, that's not the next best thing, I would say. You could also play 3 copies of Extravagance and then more copies of Trap Trick with other trap cards and just try to play more of like a really hard control game. But I think this is just the best for playing into a board and also just going first. But yeah, these cards are just insane in this deck. Your extract doesn't really matter that much, so they are basically free. And then the last spell we play is the 1 Reasoning. I think you still play this in the going first build because you don't have to tribute, and just milling Infernoids is always good. You don't even play the 1 Monster Gate anymore because you have to tribute a monster for that, and when we had 3 Monster Gate, it was reliable to have Lair and Monster Gate playing into a board. But now when it's at 1, like, I just don't even know if it's good enough to build the deck around anymore. So I think Reasoning is still insane, obviously, because it's free. That's the big reason I play it. But yeah, that's it for the spells. Moving into the trap cards, we have 3 copies of Void Feast. This is the heart and soul of the deck at this point. This just sends a Void spell trap from hand or face up field to the grave to special summon up to 3 Infernoids from deck, whose total levels exactly equal 8, ignoring their summoning conditions. There's no once per turn on this card, and it also does not say that it cannot send itself. So there's a cute play that I'll get to when we get into sort of like the test hand / combo tutorial half of the video. that shows how broken this card really is. And then finishing out the main deck, we have 2 copies of Trap Trick. Like I said, if you don't have access to Prosperity, you can 100% bump this up to 3 and then play more trap cards and sort of play that build of the deck. But Trap Trick is just very good in this deck at 2, I believe, because you don't really want to see multiples of it. You only ever want to resolve it once, and that is to find your Void Feast with it. This just becomes the 4th and 5th copies of Trap Trick. I mean, the 4th and 5th copies of Void Feast, and then Vanishment also searches Feast. So it just gives you more ways into that card. But that is it for the main deck. Let's get into the extra. The extra matters somewhat. There are some specific cards that do actually matter quite a lot. So of course, the one monster that you are always summoning as much as possible is your 3 copies of INFERNOID Tierra. She's very, very good, obviously. There is no once per turn on this card either, so it doesn't really come up where you resolve double imagination in a game, but you can resolve twice in 1 turn sometimes, and you can attempt to resolve for effect twice. It's cool. But you're only really playing 3 because of Extravagance. With Prosperity, it doesn't matter as much because you can elect to not banish it, but even with Prosperity, I typically keep at most 2 of these in the extra deck, but normally I just banish 2 of them. With the Tierras, we also play 3 copies of Elder Entity Entis. It's just free. Like, the thing with Tierra that we've been doing for years is you summon Tierra and you use your effect to send 3 copies of Entis just to completely shatter your opponent's board. That's just as good now as it was then. I'm not gonna lie about that. Then we do play a healthy dose of Link monsters. We play 1 Almirage. This is something that Elijah suggested, and it was actually really good because Decatron not gaining the attack and defense of the monster that it sends is really good, because if you're just purely trying to dump Noids to grave, you can just normal it, get the effect to send, use the effect on board if it's like one of the little ones, and then link it off for this, so you have 2 Infernoids in grave, because the Infernoids cannot banish other Infernoids from field. So this actually came up quite a bit. It was really good as well, just protecting from destruction. It happened once where I protected my Sidestamon from an Afterburners, and that ended up just winning the game. So that was really good. 1 copy of Anima. I never summoned this, but it is there in theory it's really good, just if your opponent's zone placement gets sloppy. 1 copy of Hida. This is very good with Ash Blossom, as well as the fact that you can just add a Decatron from deck to hand sometimes. It's pretty cool. 1 Dark. This is only okay in this deck, but because of Lair, it does get a little bit better. I've never made it, but I know there's some scenarios where it does come up. Doolittle's crazy in this deck, unironically. One play that I normally did is I just made this, usually for free with like a Decatron or like some other previously summoned like Infernoid, and then a little one, and then crashed it to add a Decatron back so I can get that effect to send and then gain that monster's effect as well. This card's unironically really good in this deck specifically, so I just find that really just to kind of be funny. 1 copy of Beat Cop. You play this because it is a monster that tributes, and you can do that under Lair. It's just a free monster summon that tributes, and it also is a link, so that does come up for your Echomax OTKs. 1 copy of Phoenix. I summoned this exactly once in the entire time I've been playing it. Probably doesn't need to be there, but you play the 1 just because. 1 Echomax because this card says hit really, really hard. Your OTK enablers are Doolittle and Echomax, but you're not OTKing quite as much as you used to with this deck because Monster Gate, like I said, is only at 1. And then last card is the 1 Omega. This just comes up after you like resolve an Extravagance or a Prosperity and then resolve an Imagination. Sometimes you just want to put monsters back in your extra deck. Again, it's the 15th card, doesn't really matter as much as it used to because you aren't quite as aggressive with the deck as you used to be. But I think that's pretty much enough said about that. Decent extra deck for me. I haven't really had anything that I really missed in there, because I know you used to play Boral Sword. I know that the deck used to be a lot more aggressive than it is. It's still very, very aggressive. It can kill you like that, but you're not just immediately OTKing every turn like you plan to, because you are blinding first, like I said. But that is for the profile. Let's do some test hands. Alright guys, so I have my deck all shuffled up, just doing a final little shuffle. Yeah, let's do some test hands. If I don't see some of like the more niche combos / interactions, I will show those separately. But let's just see what some of the hands of this deck produce. So hand 1 is Extravagance, Lair, Vanishment, Atondel, Decatron. Whew, that's pretty good. That's exactly what you're looking for. So of course we are going to start off with our copy of Pot of Extravagance, banishing 6 cards from our extra deck. The only thing we really care about banishing here is all 3 Tierras, or all 3 Entices, which doesn't typically happen. I just went to banish 10 because I'm used to playing Desires. So we banished 1 Entis, that's fine. Banishing the Almirage might matter, but not with this hand. So we get to draw 2. Oh, sick. So this is actually really funny for a reason that I'll get into in just a second. But of course, our draws are Reasoning and Void Apocalypse. So what we will do next is we will normal summon the Decatron and use its effect. The reason we're doing this before banishment is we can send Deviati. Most people actually don't negate this, and if they don't, then our banishment's going to resolve for free. So we are going to use Decatron, like I said, to send our copy of Deviati, just to have that monster negate, which means that our banishment will be able to resolve. So we will activate the banishment and use its effect, discarding Atondel because he can summon himself from grave, so it's for free, to add our copy of Void Feast. And then from here, you just activate the lair, set 1, and go ahead. You could activate Apocalypse if you want to. I don't really think you need to, but yeah, so this is the turn 1 board. You let your opponent do their thing. I don't typically like to shotgun the feast in most scenarios. Post side, I do a little bit more because of like Feather Duster, but the whole thing is you Void Feast, sending your copy of Vanishment to summon, because we did not draw Sajet, 3 Infernoids from deck. We are going to summon 1 Decatron, 2 Decatron, and Sajet. So this is the reason, like I said, that you play Sajet. It's level 6. 6 plus 1 plus 1 is of course 8, and you want to summon as many Decatrons as possible because they're not once per turn. So on summon you do get Chainlink 1 Decatron, Chainlink 2 Decatron to send 2 Infernoids and gain their effects, name, and level. And we already have 1 Deviati. Let's send an Anunku, and let's send the second Deviati. These are of course engraved, but the way I play it is I typically just have them behind them, just so my opponent knows which one's which. It just makes it easier to keep track of. But yeah, off of that, we have 2 monster negates and banishes, 1 spell and trap negate or banish, well, negate and banish, and then 1 DD Crow. And the reason Lair is here is, of course, these guys are still weenies, but if our opponent just goes to battle phase, we can Sajet tribute their monster and just banish a card from their grave. Really, really cool. But going back to the reason I said Reasoning is funny here is because we have 3 Decatrons out of deck. The only normal summonable monster that's left in our deck is Driver. So we draw for turn, it's not Driver. We play a game called How Deep in the Deck is My Normal Summon. Let's find out, shall we? It turns out not very deep. Normally though, if it's a little bit deeper, you basically send the rest of your deck to the grave and then you just kill your opponent right there, because if all 3 1s are out, people are a lot less confident in what level to call. If they know the deck, they'll call it 6. But normally, this deck is, after all, the reason why Reasoning always has 1 called for it. But yeah, that is hand number 1. That was a very good hand, which happens fairly often playing as many pots as we do. Just being able to dig for specific cards in this deck is absolutely incredible. So that was hand 1. Let's see what hand 2 has to offer. Let me also put my extract back. Alright, hand number 2. Lair, Trap Trick, Deviati, Trulia, Void Feast. Not quite as good, but again, it still does get into where we want. So we activate the Lair, and I'm actually going to be a little bit aggressive with it. I'm going to summon the Petrulia, set the Trap Trick, and pass. You don't want to set the Void Feast because you want to use the Trap Trick, banish the second Feast to be able to set the third from your deck, and Feast only sends from face up field, so you just want to keep this in hand, just so that you're able to fire this. And the reason we summon Petrulia is that even if the Feast gets ashed, we still have disruption during our opponent's turn to be able to tribute a monster they control and then banish a card from their grave. Obviously the top deck isn't quite good there. You do need some more gas to really be able to put on the pressure, but again, not as good of a hand, but you're still able. They have to have a negate for that Void Feast, and if they don't, then you're putting up the same board as earlier with 2 negates and a bigger DD Crow. Like, it's pretty nice. That was a little bit more of like an average hand. Your hands are normally about like that, where they're fairly good. They're not insane as often, but fairly good is more than often than not enough. these days. So, hand number 3, what we got? Vanishment is already full combo, so that's good. Extravagance, Apocalypse, Anonku, Gamma. Good lord. So yeah, this hand is also insane because we have Vanishment, which is the entire Void Feast line, but we also have Gamma to protect us from Ash throughout the entire duration of attempting to resolve it. As well as just negating Ash on this Extravagance, for example. So we fire Extrav, banish 6. Again, we really prefer to not banish the Tierras, but it doesn't entirely matter all that much because with Vanishment, we drew an Anonku, we're probably not going to be resolving Imagination this game. Imagination is very much sort of like the going second card of choice in this deck at this point, but yeah. So we can see our Extravagance, we banished a Tierra and we banished an Entis, but that doesn't really matter. So we're going to draw 2. Wow, speak of imagination, there it is. Another Vanishment is kind of whatever. It's okay, it means we have another feast for follow-up if need be. So yeah, we activate the Vanishment, like I said earlier, use the effect discarding the Anonku this time to add our copy of Void Feast, and then you've seen this song and dance before at this point. It's very simple. You just set that, you pass, at some point during your opponent's turn you activate the Feast, sending the Vanishment, and you summon all 3 guys from deck. Decatron, Sajet, and then the Decatrons get their various effects, typically Monster Negate Banish, Spell Trap Negate Banish. Pretty standard. So that's it for the test hands. There are a couple niche things that I would like to show off though, one of which being a way to resolve double Void Feast. So, what this takes normally is Vanishment plus another copy of Feast, which isn't super hard to find. The rest of the cards in your hand can literally be whatever, it does not matter. Oh cool, Prosperity, I can show the power of this in this deck as well. So obviously we're going to be resolving this core combo, but this hand is also good because it shows off possibly how good Prosperity can be in this deck. So of course we will Prosperity. Normally what I banish with this is one of the Tierras, the Dark, one of the Entis, the Beat Cop, sometimes the second Tierra, just depending on like how the rest of the hand looks. In this case, the second Tierra, because if I'm resolving double Void Feast, I'm absolutely not resolving Imagination. It's very weird for me to do so at that point. And then the Nightmare Phoenix. So we are almost always firing Prosperity for 6 because it is completely free, as we see. Like none of this ever actually really matters. So we banish that, and let's see how far we can dig. So Imagination, Driver, nice, always. Saistamas, another Banishment. Imagination, another Prosperity. So we can see if we didn't open Vanishment, say this was like Imagination Feast, which is still good, but we did find a Vanishment, this is huge because this gets us to the double Void Feast line. But I think just for follow-up, taking a second, the more Vanishments in your hand, unless it's like exactly 3, the better. So you just always want to have this card. And then yeah, put the rest of them on the bottom of the deck. So that shows how good Prosperity can be in the deck. Now let's show off the double Void Feast line. So we start with Vanishment. We use its effect, discard whatever. If you have Annoyed that's not level 4 or lower, you always want to discard that one usually. So in this case, discarding Atondel to add a copy of Void Feast. It is important also that we did not draw any Decatrons, and we also did not draw the Sajet. So that just is pretty important because this combo is going to summon 5 monsters to our field during our opponent's turn. So we're going to set both Void Feasts and pass. So the play here is you activate the Void Feast, sending the Vanishment. At some point during your opponent's turn, it doesn't really matter when. And then you chain the second Void Feast, sending the first, because it doesn't, at that point, the first one is face up on the field, so it is free game to fire, and there's no once per turn on this card, so you just get to summon 5 monsters from deck. So I'm going to resolve the second one first, summoning Sajet and 2 Decatrons. Then resolving the first one, we're going to summon Saistamas and the 3rd Decatron. So there's a lot going on here. On summon, we're going to have chain links 1, 2, 3, all of which are going to send Annoyed, gain its names, effect, and level. So one of them is going to be a Nonku, typically, and the other 2 are going to be Deviati. So we can see off of 2 cards, 2.5 cards, we have 2 Monster Negate and Banishes, 2 DD Crows, 1 Spell Trap Negate and Banish, and then a metric ton of follow-up, because this puts 8 Noids in grave, which means you can summon your Saistamas repeatedly, just start poking into the board. That's very good. And as you can see with just the way our hand was, we have another Vanishment for follow-up. So, oh cool, Top Deck Imagination, that's dead. yeah, we can just see how strong Void Feast is as a card, and I think building around it with this type of deck, like the way it has to be at this point because of one Monster Gate, I think that's really just honestly the way to go. So that is it for my Infernoid deck profile. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I'm really passionate about this deck. I've been playing it for a while, and I'm really excited that the format is kind of shaping up to be able to really play it effectively again. So I've been Pay8. I'm still feeling great. I'll see y'all on the next one. Peace.